Hello, my dear friends. She did not choose her scent. She was not allowed to touch her skin. For royal women in ancient Greece, hygiene was not a personal choice, but an imposed ritual. Every drop of oil, every strand of towel, every stroke of the razor was a sign of control. No one asked her if she felt clean. They just looked to see if she looked clean. Purity was not a feeling, but a carefully crafted appearance every day. Tonight, we enter the harem where cleanliness is an order, and women's bodies are no longer their own. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If you ever believed that royal women in ancient Greece had full control over their daily lives, hygiene would challenge that idea. Cleanliness wasn't just a habit, it was a display of order, rank, and tradition. The process didn't belong to the woman, it belonged to the people around her. Her body was the object, but not the subject. From the moment she opened her eyes, everything was already in motion. Servants didn't wait for her to wake. They walked in, each with a task they had done 100 times before. The sequence never changed. First came the water. It had been boiled with rosemary or bay leaves, not for comfort, but to signal purity. Then came the towels, folded perfectly, arranged from smallest to largest, always in the same order. Then the oils, uncorked and placed in the correct spot on a small tray. Every tool had a position, every person had a role. There was no improvising, and she wasn't expected to speak. The room was silent. That was part of the ritual. Her job was to stay still and let the process happen. One servant began by wiping her face with warm water. Another worked gently along her arms with soft linen. A third stood nearby with a bowl of oil. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't give permission. She complied because that was what noble women did. It always started with the upper body. The order mattered. Face, neck, shoulders, arms, then torso, then legs. The woman who handled the oil never handled the feet. The one who held the towels never touched skin. These boundaries weren't random. They were taught. Overstepping them could mean reassignment or punishment. The oils were expensive, but not chosen for her comfort. Olive oil was the base, but it was often blended with imported ingredients like myrrh or spikenard. The scent was subtle. It wasn't meant to stand out. It was meant to match the woman's position. Some oils were reserved for priestesses or wives of high officials. Others were used only during specific lunar cycles. The oil wasn't rubbed in. It was pressed into the skin using a cloth and a palm. No direct hand contact. That too was a rule. After oiling, the body was blotted dry. The clothes used for this step were different from those used earlier. There was no overlapping. Everything had its phase. It wasn't hygiene, it was protocol. A royal bath could be mistaken for a military drill if not for the smell of lavender. Fingernails were inspected next. Not trimmed without reason, just cleaned and shaped. No polish. Natural colour was required. Toenails were checked too, even though they would be covered. Skin was inspected for dryness, redness, or marks. These were not treated casually. A small blemish might trigger a change in oil, or even in diet. Every detail fed back into the system. There was no asking the woman how she felt. That wasn't the point. Cleanliness wasn't about her comfort. It was about how she looked to others. And how she smelled. Her scent entered a room before she did. That was intentional. Her perfume was chosen, measured, and applied without her input. One dab behind the ears, one at the wrist, one at the chest. Always the same. Compared to today's private shower, towel, and deodorant, this was something else entirely. It was like a ceremony performed by others on a body that was expected to be silent and passive. She never dried herself. She never touched the oil bottle. She never picked the cloth. Everything was prepared, applied, cleaned, and replaced without her lifting a finger. Some would say that sounds like luxury, but it wasn't relaxing. It was structured. Even the room itself reflected that. Every object had its place. If a bowl was set down an inch off centre, someone corrected it. Mistakes were recorded. If a towel was reused by accident, the maid could be removed. If the oil left a stain on her undergarment, someone was blamed. The woman herself would not be scolded publicly, but her reputation would take the hit. It would be said that her household lacked discipline, that she couldn't maintain order, that her upbringing had failed. Honestly, it's hard to imagine living like that every single day, knowing your own body was someone else's job. Before clothing could begin, a final step was performed. A thin balm was applied to her skin, made from beeswax, petals, and fine powders. It melted just enough to leave a sheen. If it melted too much and stained the linen, it was a problem. If it didn't melt enough, the skin looked dull. Every result carried consequences. Only after this step could her dressing servants come in. They were not the same women who handled her hygiene. That line was strict. These groups did not overlap. The ones who bathed her left before the ones who dressed her arrived. There was a pause between the two roles, like a handoff in a theatre backstage. On certain days, the process took longer. Feast days, religious rituals, birthdays. Those days required water from special wells. Sometimes it had to be boiled 3 times. Sometimes it was cooled with polished stones. The towels were larger, with embroidered edges. The oils were swapped for rare blends. But the woman's role didn't change. She remained still, quiet, and obedient. Privacy was another rule. No one outside her assigned maids was allowed to see her mid-process. Not even other noble women. Not even her husband. She had to appear already prepared, to look clean without showing the work behind it. That made her seem effortless, almost untouchable. If a mistake happened, it wasn't discussed openly, but everyone knew. A late appearance, a visible rash, a strong scent. It meant the system had failed. It meant she had failed. It could affect her standing, her marriage prospects, and even her children's reputation. In this world, a towel in the wrong place could change the direction of a family. By night, the system ran again in reverse. Makeup removed with rosewater and milk, feet cleaned a second time, skin dusted with dry powder. The bed was checked for creases, bugs, and dampness. She slept on perfumed linens. No one would admit it, but she was being cleaned for tomorrow even as she slept. She wasn't dirty, but she was always being purified, not because of how she lived, but because of who she was. Her body had to be kept in a state of permanent readiness. No one asked if she felt clean. They only cared if she looked clean. The next part of her day was even more controlled. When bathing ended, preparation for sacred rituals or marriage nights began. And there, being clean meant something far more invasive. The moment her cleansing routine ended, another set of servants stepped in. These were not the ones who boiled the water or folded the towels. Their role was different. They were responsible for touching her body, but only within the limits of their assigned zones. Each part of the royal woman's body was assigned to a different person. One for her arms, one for her legs, one for her neck and shoulders. The woman herself never touched her own skin. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a rule she grew up with. Even as a child, she was taught to keep her hands at her sides during cleansing. Reaching to scratch her arm or wipe her own mouth would earn her a quiet correction. Touching oneself was not only discouraged, it was considered improper. A lady of noble rank didn't groom herself. That was left to others. There was no moment in the day when she applied her own balm or adjusted her own undergarment. Her hands were not trained for that. Her body was seen as something valuable, like a statue or an offering. If it needed to be handled, someone else would do it. Each servant knew her place. The one responsible for the feet didn't move above the ankle. The one responsible for the arms didn't touch the chest. And no one, under any circumstances, was allowed to touch the face unless it was their assigned duty. These invisible borders were part of the system. Breaking them wasn't just a mistake, it was an offence. It sounds strange now, but back then, washing your own back would have been seen as a sign that no one important cared enough to do it for you. The hands-off approach wasn't just about status, it was about separation. Royal women were not expected to manage their bodies. That was the work of attendants, all trained to be quiet, precise, and invisible. These servants didn't speak to the woman unless spoken to, and even then they answered softly, avoiding eye contact. Sometimes as many as 5 different women were assisting with bathing, not because the task required that many, but because each was restricted to one area. This created a system where the body was always under care, yet always divided. It prevented closeness. No one servant ever became too familiar with the whole person. By design, the woman was kept disconnected from herself. She didn't know the texture of her skin. She didn't notice where the oil pooled or where the water cooled first. She was the centre of the process, but she wasn't allowed to participate. This level of detachment was considered proper. Compared to today's skincare influencers who spend hours massaging their own faces, this was the complete opposite. Being clean without ever laying a finger on yourself. The tools, too, were off limits. She never held her strigil. That curved scraping blade used to remove oil and dirt was passed from hand to hand by servants, but never to hers. It was often made of silver, sometimes ivory, and inscribed with her name, but it remained something to be used on her, not by her. Even something as small as adjusting a cloth that slipped down the shoulder was handled by a maid. If her hair fell out of place during cleansing, she waited for the assigned servant to fix it. That could mean sitting in stillness for several minutes until the right person was available. There were also rules about watching. The woman being cleaned did not look directly at the servants, and the servants, in turn, did not look directly at her face unless they were handling that area. This created a ritual of touch without familiarity. It was physical, but never intimate. Honestly, I don't think many people today could stand to be that passive, having others touch your body all day, while you're not even allowed to scratch your leg. But for these women, it wasn't optional. It was the culture of the palace. The more important the woman, the stricter the boundaries. Queens had more attendants and more defined divisions of care. Princesses had fewer, but the same expectations. Even noble widows followed the same system. Only servants and slaves were allowed to bathe themselves. In fact, being seen washing your own feet was one of the quickest ways to lose social respect. Training for the hygiene servant started young. Girls from servant families were taught how to handle skin, cloth, and oil without causing bruises or leaving marks. They learned to avoid pressure points, manage temperature, and keep their fingers relaxed at all times. A harsh grip could be seen as aggression. A slip could end a career. None of this process was written down in public records. It existed in the daily rhythm of palace life, something every noble woman knew, but no one ever discussed. If you asked a Greek noblewoman about her bathing habits, she would speak about the oils, maybe the towels, but she wouldn't talk about the people who touched her, or the fact that she never touched herself. This absence of self-contact extended to other routines. She didn't brush her own hair, she didn't clip her nails, she didn't rub balm on her temples when she had a headache. Every gesture that involved her own body was either supervised or done by someone else. Even illness didn't change the rule. If she had a rash or fever, a different set of servants would be brought in, but still, not her. A healer might inspect the skin, but a maid would apply the treatment. If she wanted to adjust a wrap or repin her underlayer, she had to ask. It's not that she was weak, it's that touching herself was beneath her role. Cleanliness came through obedience, not through effort. It was something that happened to her, not something she did. This system also meant that her body was never fully hers. It was shared, seen, measured, managed. She didn't choose when to be touched or how. That choice belonged to others. In the next part, We'll see how these cleansing routines weren't just about skin, they involved oil so precious that even opening the bottle required permission. And one drop wasted could cost more than a year's food for a common family. The oil that touched her skin wasn't just for softness or scent. It was a marker of status. After all the preparation and all the hands involved, what mattered most was what got applied in the end. The oil. It was more important than the water, more symbolic than the towels, and more expensive than nearly everything else in the room. It wasn't poured casually, it was measured with care. Not a single drop was allowed to go to waste. The base oil was almost always olive. But this wasn't the same kind used for cooking or lighting lamps. It was pressed from young green olives, stored in ceramic jars, and aged in cool rooms to maintain a perfect consistency. This oil was then blended with imported essences. Some came from Egypt, others from the Levant or Crete. Common additions included myrrh, cinnamon bark, blue lotus, or frankincense resin. Each blend was prepared in advance. The woman never saw the mixing process. That was done by an appointed staff member who worked quietly in a separate chamber. The final mixture was sealed in glass or clay flasks, sometimes with wax. These flasks were stored inside wooden boxes lined with linen and bone clasps. The boxes were kept locked at all times. Only the head servant carried the key. The oil wasn't opened unless everything else was ready. First, the water, then the clothes, then the warming bowls. Once all preparations were in place, the box was unlocked and the bottle uncapped. The room often fell even quieter at that moment. The first scent of the oil meant the start of the most serious part of the routine. Only a small amount was needed. One servant would pour a few drops into her palm, then gently press it onto the woman's chest, arms, and legs. The application was slow, not rubbed in, but placed. Every movement had to be even. Too little, and the skin would appear dry. Too much, and it would stain the inner linen layers. Staining was not allowed. It was a sign of poor skill. It's hard to think of anything today that cost more per drop than these oils, except maybe printer ink. The oil had no single recipe. It changed depending on the occasion. For morning bathing, it was mild and calming. For rituals, it was richer and more layered. For weddings or formal visits, it might include expensive extracts like saffron or cardamom. These were added in quantities so small they had to be measured with a reed stick. There were also oils with religious functions. These were stored separately and touched only by staff trained in temple service. If a woman had to attend a ceremony later in the day, her oil blend would be different. Sometimes a priestess would need to approve the mixture before use. None of this was optional. Even if the woman didn't like the scent or found it too thick, she said nothing. The oil was chosen for her. Its ingredients reflected her family, her role, and the current season. Every aspect was symbolic. It told people who she was before she said anything. Compared to choosing your favourite moisturiser at a store today, this was more like being assigned a personal scent based on your birth certificate. The cost was hard to explain in numbers. One flask of oil could take months to produce and cost more than a year's food for a village. Some oils had to travel hundreds of miles before they reached the palace. They passed through ports, temples, and merchant houses, and when they arrived, they were handled with more care than gold. The servants who applied the oil were trained to use exactly the right amount. The cloth used afterward had to be thick enough to absorb the excess but soft enough not to scratch. These cloths were washed separately, never reused, and sometimes even burned after special ceremonies. Nothing about the oil was casual. If a servant spilled even a few drops, they could be punished or demoted. If the wrong oil was brought into the room, the box was relocked and replaced. Some noble houses had specific storage rooms just for oil containers. The temperature of those rooms was checked daily. I can't imagine being touched every morning by expensive oils I didn't ask for and couldn't even smell in advance. But for women of the palace, this was how it had always been. They didn't question it. The oil represented purity, wealth, and control. Not personal comfort, Even travel didn't change the routine. If a royal woman visited another estate or religious site, her oil chest went with her. Sometimes on a separate cart, carried under guard. That chest might contain only 2 small bottles, but they were considered essential. After application, the bottle was sealed again, wiped down, and placed back in the linen-lined box. The key returned to the head servant's belt, then the lid was closed. This part of the routine was always treated with quiet respect. There were no shortcuts. No substitutions. If the correct oil wasn't available, the entire bathing schedule might be delayed until it was found. Later in the day, if the woman was expected to attend a gathering or meeting, a second oil might be applied over the first. This layering created a more complex scent, but again, it wasn't her decision. The mixture was tested on fabric first to make sure it wouldn't bleed through her clothes. The final scent was subtle but deliberate, a mix of flowers, spices, and herbs meant to stay close to the skin. Not overpowering, not sweet. The goal was to smell clean, noble, and precise. There was no room for mistakes. Too little, and she seemed common. Too much, and she seemed careless. The oil wasn't about her. It was about the people who saw her, smelled her, stood near her in quiet halls. It was a signal, just like her clothes or jewellery. Her scent told a story, but it was never her story. In the next part, we'll look at the tool that followed the oil, the strigil. A simple curved blade, but in the hands of the right servant, it became one of the most important instruments in royal hygiene. Once the oil was applied and settled on the skin, the next tool was brought out. It wasn't fancy, but it was treated with great care. The strigil, a curved blade, usually made of polished metal. Its purpose was to scrape oil, sweat, and dirt gently off the skin. It didn't cut, it didn't scrub, it glided, and every royal woman had her own. Strigils were not shared. That was the first rule. Each woman had a personal one, stored in a case with a cloth wrap. Most were made of silver, some were gold, a few were decorated with ivory or gemstones, but even the plain ones were finely crafted. The more important the woman, the more decorated the tool. Some strigils had the owner's name carved into the handle. Others bore small symbols for protection or health. But no matter how they looked, they all served the same role. The servant assigned to use it didn't change. That job belonged to one person only. She knew the angle, the pressure, and the proper order of use. Starting from the neck, down the back, along the arms, then the sides of the legs, never the face, never the feet. The blade wasn't sharp, but it had to be held just right. The skin had already been warmed and softened by the oil. The strigil removed the layer without pain. It was a slow, careful process. A wipe with a linen cloth followed each stroke. The blade itself was wiped clean after every pass. The room stayed quiet. The woman stayed still. No one rushed. Sharing a strigil in the palace would have been about as acceptable as sharing a toothbrush today. Some strigils were passed down from mother to daughter, but most were made new for each young woman once she reached the age of public appearance. The tool was considered personal, even though she never touched it herself. She wouldn't hold it. She wouldn't clean it. But it still belonged to her, and no one else. Cleaning the strigil was another important task. After every use, it had to be scrubbed with warm water and powdered ash. The ash acted as a natural disinfectant. Then the blade was dried with a soft cloth and placed back in its case. If the blade showed signs of rust or dullness, it was replaced. A damaged strigil meant a careless household. Servants checked the blade each morning before it was brought into the room. If they found any flaws, they reported them immediately. In some households, a separate servant was assigned only to maintain the strigil. That person didn't bathe anyone. She only inspected, cleaned, and stored the blades. Compared to modern razors or exfoliating brushes, the strigil was simple, but it had strict rules and even stricter symbolism. The act of using the strigil was part of a larger message. A smooth, properly cleaned body reflected discipline. The process wasn't just about removing oil. It was about showing that no part of the skin had been neglected. It was about precision. And the presence of the strigil itself showed that the woman belonged to the class that could afford such care. Some blades were etched with more than names. Small messages, prayers, or family mottos were sometimes included, not for others to see, but for the sake of tradition. The blade might never leave the hands of the servant, but it still represented the woman's household. The scraping took time. It couldn't be rushed. If the oil was too thick or applied unevenly, it made the process harder. That's why the oiling had to be done correctly in the first place. Everything was linked. A mistake in one step created problems for the next. The entire hygiene process depended on consistency. I find it fascinating that something so small and quiet could carry so much weight in a woman's daily life. A strigil didn't shine like jewellery or move like clothing, but it still held meaning. It marked you as part of a world where your skin, your scent, and your stillness were always being managed. In some homes, the strigil was used more than once a day. If the woman had to attend an evening ritual or a midday meeting, she might go through the entire cleansing process again. That included oiling and scraping, even though it seemed repetitive. No one questioned it. It wasn't about what was convenient. It was about what was correct. If a visitor arrived unexpectedly, the strigil would not be rushed. The staff would still take the full time to go through the steps. Even if the woman was already late, she would never appear without having completed her preparation. Skipping the strigil was out of the question. A partially cleansed body was worse than none at all. There were also beliefs about the strigil having spiritual benefits. Some said it helped remove bad energy from the skin. Others believed it prevented illness. Whether or not that was true, the consistency of the process made people trust it. The act of scraping had been part of Greek hygiene for centuries, and it continued in the palace because it worked and because it sent the right message. Even after the process was finished, the strigil remained close by. It was kept in a clean pouch and stored either in the bathing room or the dressing area, depending on the household layout. No one else could use it, not even for emergencies. If a guest forgot theirs, a spare would be brought, never someone else's personal blade. The presence of the strigil was a quiet status symbol. It didn't speak, but it said everything. It told others that the woman who owned it didn't have to clean herself, that others were trained just to care for her, that even the tools around her followed the rules of class and tradition. In the next part, we'll turn to something even more closely guarded than the strigil, the hair. A part of the body considered sacred, and one that only the most trusted attendants were allowed to touch. Hair was treated differently from everything else. In the daily hygiene routine of royal Greek women, it was given its own time, its tools, and its own rules. It was never rushed. It was never touched by someone untrained. While the body was seen as something to be cleaned and dressed, the hair was seen as something to be honoured and protected. Not just because of appearance, but because of belief. A woman's hair was considered sacred. Each strand was thought to carry spiritual meaning. Tangled or unwashed hair could be seen as a sign of inner disorder. Well-kept hair, on the other hand, showed discipline and balance. It had to be smooth, oiled, and shaped according to rank and occasion. This made hair one of the most carefully managed parts of a woman's daily preparation. The person allowed to care for it was not just any servant. She had to be trusted. Often, she had served the family for years. Her job was not only to comb and braid, but to observe. She watched for signs of breakage or dryness. If something was wrong, she reported it and adjusted the oil mixture next time. She spoke very little. Instructions were rare. Most of the process followed an unspoken routine. Hair was never washed daily. The goal was not to strip it, but to maintain its natural oils and condition it with care. After bathing, the hair would be unwrapped slowly from the linen cloth used to keep it dry. It had been tied up carefully to avoid soaking. The maid would inspect it, then bring out the tools, the brush, the oil, the comb for sectioning. Everything had its place. The brush was often made of cypress or sandalwood. The bristles could be natural fibre or fine animal hair. The handle was carved and sometimes marked with a woman's initials or a protective symbol. This brush was not shared. You wouldn't think a wooden brush could carry so much importance, but lending it to someone else was almost like giving away a piece of yourself. The brushing took time. The maid worked from the bottom upward to avoid pulling. She held the hair firmly to reduce pain. If the hair was long, brushing could take 30 minutes. After that came oiling. The hair oil was different from the oil used on the body. It was lighter and absorbed quickly. It was often made from almond oil, fig seed oil, or a mix of olive oil with herbs. The oil was applied in drops along the scalp and through the ends. It made the hair shine, but not appear greasy. After the oil was in place, the hair was brushed again to distribute it evenly. Then it was left loose for a few minutes to settle. No one touched it during this time. It had to rest before styling. Braiding came last. The style was chosen based on the day's events. A simple braid for a quiet day. A more complex arrangement if she was expected at a ceremony. Sometimes ribbon was woven in. Sometimes a small pin was placed at the base. The hair was not pulled too tight, but it was always neat. Nothing was left out of place. Compared to today's quick ponytail or bun before heading out, this was more like building a structure that had to last all day without shifting. The maid responsible for hair worked in silence. She did not speak unless asked a question. The room stayed calm. The woman being groomed did not give instructions. Her face remained neutral. The whole process was considered private, even though it happened in front of others. The focus was on doing things right, not on conversation. Hair care did not end in the morning. If a braid loosened or a strand came free, it was fixed immediately. If the woman had to change clothes for an evening ritual, the hairstyle might be redone entirely. The same person would be called back. No one else touched it. That rule was strict. Hair was also expected to smell right. Not too strong, not too plain. The oil carried a soft scent. Sometimes herbs were tied into the braid. Lavender, rosemary, basil. Just a small piece. This was burned after the day ended. It was not saved or reused. I think sitting still for an hour every morning while someone oils and braids your hair in silence would make you feel both pampered and powerless. But for women in the palace, this was normal. They had no reason to question it. It was what they had always known. Hair was even cared for at night. Before sleep, the braid was taken out. The hair was brushed again. Another light oil was applied. A fresh linen cloth was used to wrap it. The goal was to keep it soft and free from tangles by morning. The same person who did the morning care returned in the evening. No one else was allowed to step in. Illness did not stop the routine. If the woman was unwell, the hair still had to be cared for. Not touching it was considered disrespectful to the household. Hair could not be ignored. It was part of her role, her image, and her place in society. Even girls who were not yet of age had their hair managed this way. From a young age, they were taught to keep their hands away from their heads and let others do the care. This created distance. The hair was personal, but not private. It was seen by many, touched by few, and managed by someone else. In some homes, special oils were prepared only for weddings or feast days. These were more expensive, sometimes made with imported ingredients like saffron or blue lotus. They were stored in small bottles and guarded carefully. The scent was chosen based on the event. It had to be subtle, but noticeable. It had to match the clothes and jewellery. Nothing about it was random. When everything was finished, the maid stepped back and waited for approval. The head servant would look over the final result. If a pin was crooked or a section uneven, it would be fixed before the woman stood up. She was not allowed to leave the room until every part of her hair was in place. In the next part, we will follow the scent that lingered behind her. A mixture of powders, perfumes, and cloth that told people she'd arrived even before they saw her face. Before the woman entered a room, her presence was already known. People could smell her before they could see her. It was not accidental. Her scent was part of her preparation. Just like the comb, the oil, and the linen, the fragrance she wore was chosen carefully. It was not meant to be loud. It was meant to be memorable. The scent came from powder, not liquid. This powder was kept in small ceramic jars with narrow lids and soft cloth stoppers. Inside, it looked like finely ground flour, but it carried the weight of identity. The ingredients varied: crushed rose petals, iris root, ground laurel. Sometimes there is a trace of dried orange peel or honeycomb. Everything was sifted by hand and tested on cloth before it was ever placed near the skin. The application was light. A pinch of powder was pressed into the neckline of the underdress. Another was dusted into the folds of her outer wrap. One more might be rubbed along the handle of her comb, not directly onto the body. Not over the oil. The scent was not supposed to mix with skin. It was meant to travel with fabric and movement. Servants handled the powder with precision. It was never spilled. It was never wasted. The amount used was recorded. The jars were kept in locked boxes, next to the oil flasks. Some powders were more expensive than oil, especially those with imported ingredients or rare herbs. The most prized blends came from Egypt or the islands off the coast. Each woman had her formula. It was mixed based on her age, rank, and season. The scent had to reflect her current place in the household. A girl did not wear the same powder as her mother. A widow did not wear the same blend as a bride. These differences were subtle, but they were noticed. You might think people wouldn't remember which person wore which scent. But in a palace where no one raised their voice, scent was often louder than speech. Some powders were made in small batches and used only once. Others were saved in sealed jars and brought out for special events. The shelf life of the powder mattered. If it went stale, it lost its meaning. The scent had to be fresh, not strong. Too much would be a problem. It could suggest carelessness or vanity. Too little, and the woman would seem unprepared. The person responsible for the powder was not the same as the person who applied the oil. It was a separate task, handled by a senior attendant. She held the jar with 2 hands. She stood to the side while applying it. She never touched the woman's skin, only the fabric. The touch was quick, almost invisible. Just a press of the fingers and then a pat to release the powder. Fragrance was not about attracting attention. It was about recognition. The scent had to mark the woman without overpowering the room. Guests and family members knew who was near simply by what they smelled. A familiar blend would signal her arrival. A new blend would signal a change. Birth, death, marriage, travel. All of these events had their scent instructions. Compared to today's perfume bottles and brand names, this was more like a silent signature that floated in the air and settled behind you. Once the powder was applied, the jar was closed and stored. The room was aired out. The servants washed their hands. No one wore the scent except the woman. Even the attendants avoided touching the cloth where it had been placed. The scent belonged to her alone. Sometimes the powder was used on objects too. A letter, a handkerchief, the inside of a jewellery box. It left a faint trail. Not strong, but impossible to ignore. If she passed someone in a hallway, they would know it was her. If she sat on a chair, the scent would remain for a while after she left. She never commented on the blend. That was not her role. She didn't ask what was in it or request changes. If the scent changed, she noticed, but said nothing. The staff handled it. They adjusted the ingredients as needed based on the weather or occasion. She followed the scent the way she followed the rest of the routine, with quiet acceptance. I think having a scent chosen for you and tied to your rank is both elegant and limiting. It says everything about you, except what you actually like. There were rules about where the powder could be stored, not near heat, not in moist rooms. The jars were checked weekly. If a jar was found to be cracked or damaged, it was discarded. The new powder had to be made from scratch. Some households had their own powder specialist. Others relied on vendors who delivered once a month. The powder did not cover the scent. It replaced it. Sweat was not supposed to exist. Oil had no smell. Linen was clean. The powder was the only scent allowed. If someone noticed another odour, it was treated as an emergency. The woman would be taken aside and re-cleansed. This almost never happened. The system worked. On ritual days, the powder might be applied more than once. In the morning, before the ceremony, after the meal, always the same blend, always the same process. The woman never handled the powder herself. She never touched the jar. She never brushed it off. If it fell on her wrist or sleeve, she let it stay. There were stories of women who insisted on choosing their scent. They were seen as difficult, selfish, in some cases, rebellious. Those stories served as warnings. Scent was not about expression. It was about structure. It was one more way to say who you were and where you belonged. In the next part, we return to the body. Not to scent or skin, but to what was not allowed to remain. Body hair. A part of hygiene that was not about beauty, but about control. Something to be removed on schedule, with silence, and without exception. The scent that followed her out of the room said she was ready. Her skin was oiled, her hair was braided, and her linen was clean. But for royal women in ancient Greece, that was not the full picture of being prepared. There was still one part of the body that required attention at least once a month, and it was not discussed openly. It was simply understood that hair on certain areas of the body had to go, not because it was unclean, but because it was seen as untamed. Body hair, especially on the arms, legs, and underarms, was associated with something closer to the natural world. In the minds of the palace elite, nature was something to control. The female body was expected to appear smooth, regulated, and managed. Any sign of hair that was not on the scalp or eyebrows was treated as a flaw, not just in beauty, but in discipline. This belief had social weight. A woman with visible body hair was seen as careless or untrained. In some circles, she might even be viewed as rebellious. Clean-skinned, in their eyes, meant hairless skin. It showed that a woman had servants, time, and structure in her daily life. It proved she belonged to a different level of society. Once every month, a special session was arranged. Some called it a ritual, others treated it like a small ceremony. The same group of trusted servants carried it out. The woman would sit on a low-cushioned bench, usually in a private bathing room with heavy curtains drawn. The mood was quieter than usual. The materials were set on a separate table: wax, linen strips, herbal compresses, and a cooling salve. The wax was made from honey, resin, and oil. It was warmed in a clay bowl placed near the fire. The consistency had to be just right, not too runny, not too firm. A servant would test it on her wrist before applying it to the woman's body. The strips were clean linen, cut into narrow bands and folded neatly. The cloth was never reused. The woman did not flinch. She had done this many times before. Her arms were held out. Her legs were positioned as needed. The wax was spread with a wooden paddle. Then the strip was pressed on and pulled off quickly. The process was repeated in sections. The underarms came last. After each pull, the skin was pressed with a warm cloth, then cooled with herbal paste. You might say it was like a spa treatment, if your spa included hot wax and no right to say no. The servants did not speak unless something needed adjusting. The entire process took around 30 to 40 minutes. It was considered a normal part of the woman's maintenance. Even if she had no events that week, the session still took place. Skipping it was not acceptable. There were exceptions for illness or injury, but even then, a shortened version might be carried out. The goal was not to create a perfect appearance every day. It was to make sure the body never fell below the expected standard. If hair grew back too quickly, an earlier session would be arranged. If the skin reacted badly to the wax, a different mixture was prepared for next time. The woman was not expected to request this ritual. It was part of her calendar. Her attendants knew the date. They gathered the materials, prepared the room, and gave her a simple signal when it was time. She walked in. She sat down. She followed the steps. Then she walked out. Compared to using a razor in the shower today, this looked more like preparing livestock for a formal parade. After the waxing, the cooling balm was applied. It was made from crushed herbs, rose water, and sometimes a touch of honey. The skin was gently wiped with a cloth soaked in the mixture. No scent was added. The goal was to soothe, not perfume. The woman was then left to rest for a few minutes, lying on her side, covered by a linen sheet. This short rest was the only moment of pause in the entire session. No one spoke. The servants cleaned the tools and folded the towels. When the woman stood, she was helped into a fresh wrap. The discarded strips and wax were burned later that evening, usually with the other waste from the bathing rooms. I think calling this a beauty treatment misses the point. It was control in the form of grooming. The message behind the hair removal was clear. A smooth body was not just desirable, it was mandatory. Women who refused the wax were seen as difficult. Sometimes it is even dangerous. Refusing could lead to quiet judgment from other noble families. Rumours might spread that she was neglecting her duties or that she had lost discipline. For young women, skipping the ritual could hurt future marriage prospects. Most royal women accepted the process without question. They had grown up watching it happen. Their mothers, their older sisters, the women around them all followed the same steps. There was no discussion about whether it was necessary. It was simply what was done. Even older women who had passed childbearing age continued the ritual. The idea was not tied to fertility, it was tied to appearance and identity. Once you were part of the palace world, you stayed within its structure. Cleanliness was not something you aged out of. It followed you until your last day. Some households had variations. A few used tweezers instead of wax. Others preferred plucking certain areas by hand, using silk threads. But the purpose was always the same: to remove the hair, to reveal the skin, to show that nothing wild remained. After the session, the woman might avoid sun exposure or friction from tight clothing. These were small precautions to prevent irritation. She might also apply extra oil that night, just on the treated areas. That was one of the few choices she got to make, and even that was usually suggested by someone else. In the next part, we will look at another personal item that defines a woman's care. Not the skin, not the oil, but something simple and carved. The comb, a tool so personal that even mothers and daughters were forbidden to share it. After the skin had been smoothed and the body inspected, one item remained close to the royal woman's hand. It was not her mirror, it was not her fan, it was her comb, small enough to fit in a cloth pouch, strong enough to carry meaning far beyond its size. To the outside world, it might look like a simple grooming tool. Inside the palace, it was a symbol of control, privacy, and personal power. The comb was not shared, not with sisters, not with daughters, not even with mothers. Each woman had her own. From the time she entered puberty, a comb was given to her as part of her household belongings. It stayed with her until death. When she died, it was often placed in her grave, wrapped in linen or sealed in a wooden box. Most combs were carved from ivory or sandalwood. Some were made from cypress or boxwood. The more valuable ones had handles shaped like birds or flowers. Others were polished but straightforward, smooth, worn down by years of use. The teeth were narrow and strong, designed to pass through oiled hair without breaking. There was no decoration just for the sake of beauty. Everything on the comb had a purpose. You might think a woman would share a comb the same way people today share hair ties or clips, but that was completely out of the question. The comb belonged only to her. It was considered an extension of her presence. If it was misplaced, servants were expected to stop what they were doing and look for it. If it was damaged, a new one had to be carved quickly, and even then, it was treated with suspicion. A replacement never carried the same meaning as the original. Most women had only one comb. It travelled with them. If she visited another estate or temple, the comb was packed in her personal chest. It was wrapped in a cloth scented with herbs and tucked between layers of linen. Even her husband could not touch it. If he needed a gift comb for a relative, he would have it made separately and never borrow hers. The comb was used in private. Unlike the hairbrush, which a maid might handle. The comb was usually used by the woman herself, not in the morning, but later in the day. It was brought out in moments of quiet, after lunch, before rest, before bed. It was not about styling, it was about touch, a way to feel her hair, to move through the strands without anyone else watching. Compared to the endless beauty tools and products available today, this one item did more than most people expect from an entire shelf of cosmetics. Using the comb was a private act. It was not considered part of the main hygiene process, but it was tied to well-being. Some said combing helped clear the mind. Others said it helped maintain order in the body. A woman might comb her hair slowly while sitting near the window. The strokes were steady. There was no mirror, no need for approval. The comb was also used during transitions, before travel, before a religious ceremony, before marriage. On these days, it was not just a grooming tool, it was part of the preparation ritual. Combing the hair was a way to mark change. Some households even had a special chant or phrase they repeated quietly while doing it. Servants knew never to clean or touch the comb unless told to. If a maid accidentally picked it up or moved it, she could be removed from the bathing team. It was one of the few items that even high-ranking guests were not allowed to borrow. Asking to see a woman's comb was considered inappropriate. Asking to use it was unthinkable. I find it fascinating that such a small object could hold so much meaning in a world filled with gold and jewels. It was not wealth that gave the comb power. It was time, years of use, a lifetime of small gestures, repeated every day. When the woman died, her comb was placed near her body, not in the public part of the funeral display, but close to the skin, sometimes under the pillow, sometimes beneath the veil. It was one of the last items she touched. In some regions, a second comb was broken during mourning to mark the loss. It was not reused. It was not passed down. That comb had done its work and was laid to rest. Even young girls understood this rule. They did not reach for their mother's comb. They waited for their own. When it came, it was treated like something alive. It was stored properly, cleaned with care, never dropped, never shown off. There were rare occasions when a comb might be gifted, usually, between a dying woman and her closest companion. But even then, the act was surrounded by ritual. The comb was washed, wrapped in a clean cloth, handed over in silence. It was not meant to be used again, but to be kept as a memory. Some women had short poems carved on the back, just a few words, a name, a phrase, a sign. These inscriptions were often private, not read aloud, not discussed. The woman knew what it said. That was enough. The comb's strength was in its simplicity. It was not large, it did not sparkle, but it was always there, on the shelf, in the chest, in her hand. Day after day, it asked for no attention, but it meant everything. In the next part, we will look beyond objects and return to the space itself, not the tools, but the water, not just how it felt, but what it meant. Because in the palace, even the bath water had rules. It was never just water. It was prepared, tasted, and blessed before a single drop touched the skin. If the body was sacred, then the water that touched it had to be chosen with care. Royal women in ancient Greece never bathed in ordinary water. That concept did not exist for them. Water was not just a liquid, it was a substance that had to be prepared, scented, tested, and sometimes even blessed. Every bath started long before the first drop touched the skin. First came the fire. Not just any wood could be used, it had to be fragrant. Sandalwood, laurel branches, or dried rosemary were the most common. These were gathered, dried, and stacked in a separate corner of the household. The servants in charge of heating water knew exactly how many branches were needed to bring a large clay basin to the right temperature. They monitored the flame closely. Once the water began to boil, herbs were added, not in large quantities, just a few sprigs of bay leaf, mint, or crushed marjoram. These were tied in linen bundles and dropped into the pot. As the steam rose, the scent filled the room, It signalled that the process had begun. No one poured the water until the scent had fully developed. The boiling water was never used directly. It was always mixed with cooler water to bring it to the correct warmth. But even the cool water had to be filtered. It was drawn from a specific well or spring, usually in the early morning, and stored in sealed jars. The two types of water were combined in large mixing basins, stirred with wooden paddles, and tested again. You might expect all this for a royal feast, but this was the same effort just to prepare a single bath. Before the water was brought to the bathing room, a servant tasted it, not for flavour, but to confirm the scent and clarity. She would dip a finger into the basin and touch it to her lips. If it smelled off or tasted bitter, the entire pot was discarded. This test was not done in front of the woman. It happened quietly, behind the scenes, as part of the larger ritual. There was a belief that using cold or impure water could invite the anger of the gods, not in a dramatic way, but in the slow form of illness, bad dreams, or misfortune. The woman herself might not speak of these fears, but the staff understood them. Every precaution was taken. Even the clay basins were cleaned and dried carefully before being filled. The water was carried in by hand, usually 2 servants, sometimes more, depending on the size of the bath. The containers were wrapped in cloth to hold heat. The floor of the bathing room was covered in linen mats to avoid any dirt or dust from reaching the basin. Once the water was poured, the door was closed. The room held the warmth, and the scent became stronger. The woman did not test the water herself. She trusted the system. She entered the room when called, stepped onto the mat, and was seated on a low stool. One servant poured the water slowly from a jug, starting at the shoulders and moving downward. Another caught the runoff with a second basin, careful not to let it splash. The entire process was timed to make sure the water did not cool too quickly. Servants did not speak during this stage. It was considered the most serious part of the cleansing. The heat opened the skin. The scent filled the air. The woman sat with her eyes lowered, not from submission, but from habit. There was no need to look around. She knew what was happening. It had been the same her whole life. Compared to stepping into a hot shower today, this was more like entering a room-sized teacup prepared by a silent team of herbalists. The water used for rinsing the hair was separate. It had fewer herbs to avoid leaving residue. It was also warmer to ease the untangling process. A servant would gently pour it while another held a cloth to keep it from running into the woman's eyes. The towel used afterward was thicker and longer than the one used for the body. Again, all of this followed a set pattern. There were also rules about when water could not be used. On certain days tied to moon cycles or religious fasts, only dry cleaning methods were allowed. The woman would still go through most of the hygiene routine, but without bathing. Instead, powders, oils, and linen cloths were used to wipe and refresh the body. Even on those days, water was prepared, in case a small amount was needed. Water was never reused. Once it touched the skin, it was gone. It was poured away into a separate drain, then flushed with an herbal rinse. The basins were scrubbed. The clothes were soaked. No part of the bath was recycled. That idea would have been considered disrespectful. There were even stories of women asking to bring home a small jar of the bath water from a queen's chamber, hoping it would bring them luck. No one confirmed if this ever worked, but the jars were seen from time to time, wrapped in ribbon and placed on shelves like charms. I think the way they treated water shows how little they separated body care from belief. It wasn't about feeling fresh, it was about doing things properly. When the bath was finished, the woman was dried with a linen sheet that had been warmed earlier. The scent of the water stayed on her skin, underneath the layer of oil and powder that came next. It was subtle but distinct. If she passed someone in the hall, they would notice the herbs, the heat, and the clean. After the bath, the leftover water was poured outside the private quarters, never in the general drains. It had touched the body of someone important. It deserved to be released properly. Some households even burned incense afterward to cleanse the air. The next part of her care focused not on heat or water, but on breath. Not the scent she wore, but the smell of her mouth. Because even the cleanest woman in the palace could not speak with authority if her breath did not match the rest of her image. After her skin had been rinsed and dried, and the scent of laurel still lingered in the room, there was one more part of the body that had to be addressed: the mouth. Royal women in ancient Greece were rarely expected to speak first, but when they did speak, the expectation was clear. Their breath had to be clean, not just neutral, clean enough to match the rest of the ritual. No odour of fish, meat, or garlic. No trace of yesterday's meal. If the skin was soft and the hair smooth, then the breath had to be equally controlled. The process was simple, but strict. Before any important conversation, the woman chewed something, not gum, not candy, leaves, twigs. Resin. One of the most common choices was mint. Fresh sprigs were kept in clay jars, picked from the palace garden or purchased from trusted vendors. A few leaves were chewed slowly, then swallowed or discarded depending on the preference of the household. Another option was mastic. This was a resin collected from the bark of the mastic tree. It looked like small beads or crystals. It softened when chewed and released a faint pine-like aroma. Mastic was more expensive than mint, so it was used for formal events or religious meetings. Women chewed it before receiving guests or attending temple processions. Licorice root was also used. It had a thicker texture and a stronger aftertaste. Some women preferred it for its sweetness. Others found it too bold and used it only before speaking in court or during rituals involving singing. The choice of what to chew was never random. It matched the setting, the time of day, and the woman's role in the gathering. You might think chewing herbs sounds like a refreshing break, but they were not chewing for enjoyment. They were doing it to keep their words from smelling like lunch. In addition to chewing, there were mouth rinses. These were prepared by servants and kept in covered jugs near the bathing supplies. The main ingredient was vinegar, not sour, biting vinegar, but diluted mixtures combined with aromatic oils. Some households used rosemary-infused vinegar. Others preferred mixtures with clove or cinnamon bark. The rinse was poured into a shallow cup, swished for a few moments, then spit into a special bowl. This bowl was not the same as the ones used for washing or oiling. It had a different shape and was emptied immediately after use. No one wanted the smell of used rinse lingering in the room. The cup and bowl were cleaned separately. The process was quiet and quick, done in the moments before the woman stepped into her public role for the day. The goal was not to add a strong smell, it was to remove any sign of food or dryness. Even if she had not eaten, the rinse was still required. The idea of speaking with an unprepared mouth was considered careless. It suggested a lack of discipline. Even in private conversations, noble women were expected to smell clean when they spoke. Servants sometimes tested the rinse beforehand. They would sniff the mixture or take a drop on their wrist and rub it. If the scent was too sharp, it was adjusted. If it was too weak, more oil was added. The woman herself never made these decisions. She followed the same steps each day. Compared to today's toothpaste and mints, this method was quieter, slower, and much more about keeping appearances than promoting health. After rinsing, the woman waited for a moment before speaking. This pause gave the aroma time to settle and the breath time to even out. Only then would she greet someone or begin a conversation. If she had to give instructions, she would do so knowing her words would not be clouded by unwanted smells. This mattered most when she had to give orders. In the palace, power could come from subtlety. A single sentence from a royal woman could carry weight. If that sentence was delivered with foul breath, it lost its edge. People might not say anything, but they would remember. They would mention it in whispers. They would tell others that she was slipping, that she was not being properly kept. That risk was taken seriously. Some households kept detailed records of rinse ingredients and usage. If a servant failed to prepare the rinse, it could be seen as negligence. If a woman were caught with poor breath in a formal setting, her entire hygiene staff might be questioned. The responsibility was shared. I think it's a reminder that even speech had to be washed before it was used. The body was not the only thing under control. Words had to be filtered too. In certain rituals, the rinse was more than hygiene, it was symbolic. Women would sip a floral rinse before speaking prayers. Some temples required worshippers to cleanse their mouths before entering. The rinse was seen as removing not just odour, but impurity. It marked the line between private thought and public speech. On long days, when the woman had to speak with many people, she might carry a small packet of mint leaves in her sleeve. These were wrapped in cloth and tied with a string, if needed. She would chew one discreetly before stepping into a new room. The chewing was done quietly, never in sight of others. No one commented on a woman's breath directly, but everyone noticed. The absence of smell was expected. The presence of it created distance. Even a trace of fish or stale oil was enough to change how someone listened. In court, in family meetings, in public ceremonies, the mouth had to be as prepared as the rest of the body. This care extended into the evening. Before bed, a final rinse was offered. It was lighter, often mixed with rose water. The goal was to leave the mouth soft, clean, and lightly scented. Even in sleep, the woman was not allowed to forget the rules of presentation. In the next part, we move from scent and speech to the fabric used to present the body. Not the dress itself, but the towel. A single piece of cloth that held more ceremony than most garments. It was not used for drying, it was used for showing, and it had its own set of rules. Once her mouth was rinsed and her hair adjusted, the final object placed in the room said everything without a word. The towel. Not the kind meant to dry water, not something to scrub the skin. This towel was part of the ritual, but it served a different purpose. It was soft, embroidered, and highly visible. Everyone in the palace knew it was not to be treated like an ordinary cloth. The towel was laid out on a small table before the woman entered the bathing chamber. It was not folded in half, but lengthwise, to display the patterns stitched into it. These patterns were done by hand. They were not decorative in the modern sense. Each design had meaning. Some towels carried images of peacocks, others showed lotus flowers, vines, or female deities with open hands. These were not selected at random. The images depended on the woman's status and the occasion. A newly married woman might use a towel with twin birds facing each other. A widow might have a towel with a single flower enclosed in a ring. These choices were not explained aloud. Everyone in the household understood them without being told. They were part of the silent language of status. The fabric was always linen, softened over time, but never too thin. The embroidery thread was usually dyed with plant-based colours, blue from woad, yellow from saffron, red from crushed berries or insect shells. The work was done by professional needleworkers, often older women from respected craft families. It sounds a bit dramatic, but using the wrong towel was enough to cause a quiet scandal in the halls. The towel was only used once, not for wiping the body, but for covering it. After the bath, the woman was wrapped in it briefly while the oil was prepared. It touched her shoulders, arms, or legs, depending on the bathing sequence, but not to dry. If the towel absorbed any moisture, it was seen as an accident. That was not its role. Once used, the towel was placed back on the table, folded inward to hide the embroidery. A servant collected it with both hands and brought it to the laundry room. There, it was washed separately from other linens. After drying, it was pressed with heated stones. The stones were flat and smooth, placed into a metal pan and left over hot coals. They were then rolled gently across the fabric to remove every crease. The embroidery had to be preserved. No pulling, no shrinking. The towel was then wrapped in clean cloth and stored in a chest lined with cypress wood. Some households rotated 5 to 10 towels for one woman. Others had a larger collection. The older towels were not thrown away. They were either burned with herbs during ritual cleanings or donated to temples. Compared to today's fluffy bath towel, This was closer to wearing a certificate of rank right after stepping out of hot water. Sometimes the towel became more than a household object. In certain cases, it was offered as a gift to a temple. This was done quietly. A woman might request that her towel from a special occasion be placed at the feet of a statue. The embroidery told the story. The priestesses understood. The towel was folded, carried on a tray, and laid gently on the altar. It was not reused after that. Towels also played a role in religious milestones. Girls coming of age were often given their first embroidered towel during a family ceremony. It was shown to other women in the household, then put away until needed. After the first bath as an adult, it was brought out, used, and stored again. The act marked a transition. No words were needed. The household servants never used these towels, not even by accident. Even if one was found on the floor, no one picked it up casually. It was handled like jewellery. It was folded slowly. It was moved with care. If one was damaged, a replacement had to be made immediately. But even a new towel could not erase the mistake. I think a towel treated like a sacred object says more about their values than any long speech could. It wasn't about fabric. It was about meaning. Women